On June 28, 1776, General George Washington stood in the abandoned mansion that served as his headquarters, surrounded by his lieutenants. Outside, New York City was in a state of chaos. In the sweltering summer heat, tensions were reaching a boiling point. Treason was in the air. Washington's lieutenants watched closely as he lingered at the front door, his hand hovering over the knob. He wanted to stay in the calm of the mansion a few minutes longer because his next appointment of the day was a grim one. He was heading to an execution. Washington adjusted the blue sash that identified him as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army and pushed the door open. Outside, he and his officers saddled their horses. As they rode through the streets of the city, the entire Continental Army fell in line behind them. Washington led his troops through the dense woods of northern Manhattan. He was flanked by the members of his Life Guards, a special unit of elite soldiers meant to protect him from harm. Usually, Washington felt confident with his guards, but today he felt uneasy, exposed, unsafe. That was because 3 days ago, Washington had discovered a British plot to kidnap and possibly kill him. It had been constructed based on information leaked by some of his Life Guards. He eyed his protectors, knowing any one of them might have betrayed him. Finally, the 10,000 soldiers in the Continental Army arrived at a clearing in the forest, a quarter-mile outside the city. Everyone looked at the hastily assembled structure in the middle of the field, the gallows. Over the next hour, thousands of civilians eager to watch justice served joined the crowd. No one wanted to miss out on this historic moment. Between the Continental soldiers and ordinary citizens, it seemed like the entire population of New York had gathered together in the field. Washington took in the nervous, excited energy. He hoped the events of the day would make clear if anyone betrayed America, they wouldn't live to tell the tale. On Washington's command, 80 soldiers armed with bayonets escorted a single prisoner to the gallows. The man's name was Thomas Hickey. He pushed his dark hair out of his eyes as he climbed the stairs on long, gangly legs. His face didn't betray any emotion, even though he was about to become the first person executed for treason against the United States of America. Washington watched as the hangman placed a noose around Hickey's neck. He felt a shiver of regret. He had liked this man. He had trusted this man. A Continental officer read the charges against Hickey. He had been stoic up until this point, but now he began to crack. Panic filled Hickey's eyes, and he trembled. The crowd booed and hissed at him. It was time for Thomas Hickey's final words. He wiped away his tears and cursed his co-conspirators. Then he closed his eyes and mouthed a silent prayer. As Hickey's body dropped, many members of the crowd looked away, but Washington wasn't one of them. His eyes narrowed with resolve. This was the cost of war, a war that was only just beginning. From Ballin Studios and Wondery, I'm Luke Lamana, and this is Redacted, Declassified Mysteries, where each week we shine a light on the shadowy corners of espionage, covert operations, and misinformation to reveal the dark secrets our governments try to hide. This week's episode is called The Plot Against George Washington. Serving in the military is similar to working in traditional civilian occupations in many ways, one of which is not always liking your boss. Maybe the key difference there is that as a civilian, you can quit your job and find a new one if you really wanted to. You can't just quit the military. With George Washington's face printed on every dollar bill and stamped on quarters, I have to admit that I've long held a very narrow view of who our first president was.
In my mind, he's more of a historical figure than a person who had the same problems at work that we do. Never once did I think that, as a military officer, he had soldiers under his command that didn't like him. It would have been the furthest thing from my mind to think that not only did they not like him, they were deliberately working to undermine his fight against the British. Fortunately for us, George Washington was clever and wore many different hats, serving in a variety of roles before becoming the first president of the United States. He was a militia officer, revolutionary delegate, and commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. But one of his lesser-known roles was as spy master. During the American Revolution, the British and the colonies fought to convert ordinary citizens to their cause, but these were desperate times and loyalty could be sold to the highest bidder. Due to the risk of betrayal, Washington needed to know which members of the Continental Army he could trust. He went to great lengths to crack British codes, detain potential spies, and uncover enemy plots within the American ranks. Under Washington, the nation's first counterintelligence operation was born. It was called the Committee on Conspiracies. In the summer of 1776, Washington's team discovered a British plot that could have ended the revolution before it really began. It involved recruiting Continental soldiers to betray the cause and assassinate their leader. The use of spycraft saved Washington's life and secured a future for America. But how did the British make their plan to take down the American commander? Why did some of Washington's most trusted soldiers betray him? And how did an ordinary colonist help Washington's counterintelligence team uncover the plot before it was too late?
At dawn on March 4, 1776, General George Washington stood at the top of a hill in Dorchester Heights, Massachusetts. He looked down on the city below. All was still. Boston was asleep, and for the moment, in the hands of the British Army. But despite the calm, Washington's heart was pounding hard in his chest. He was about to make his move to free the city. The war was really only just beginning. The Continental Congress was still 2 months away from discussing its Declaration of Independence. At this point, they were still focused on negotiating with the Crown. They hoped to find a solution that would give the colonies more authority while maintaining British control. But things had not gone according to plan. Fighting had broken out. Congress created the Continental Army as a show of strength that would improve the colonies' chances of a fair deal. George Washington, already a national hero from past wars, was unanimously chosen as its leader. For months, he and his fledgling army had been camped outside Boston, engaged in a standoff with the British. Neither side wanted to move first and risk an all-out war. Now, after months of waiting, Washington was finally launching an attack, though it was a risky one. That's why he and his troops had climbed up Dorchester Heights in the dead of night, hoping to surprise the enemy. Washington signaled to his men. As silently as they could, they rolled the last of their 20 cannons into place at the top of the hill. Each was trained directly on the British fleet below. The first rays of light came over the ocean, illuminating the fog. Washington opened his spyglass and scouted the harbor. The men on the British ships seemed to be panicking. They could see the guns on the hilltop and knew that the Americans had them trapped. They couldn't attack or flee without being blown out of the water. But Washington did not fire. He waited for 4 tense days before he received a message from the British commander with the news he'd been waiting for. The British were retreating from Boston. But the commander wanted Washington's word that they would not be attacked as they departed. Washington couldn't help but smile. The Continental Army had just won its first fight against a vastly superior army without a single casualty. Boston was free. But the war was far from over. The British weren't going to take such a humiliating loss without a fight, and Washington knew that he also needed to protect himself. With British loyalists lurking everywhere, he needed to stay vigilant and surround himself with men he could trust. Washington ordered his officers to send their best soldiers, strong fighters with records of military service. He needed an elite unit of bodyguards who would be able to protect him. They would be called the Life Guard. A few weeks later, New York City Mayor David Matthews boarded a rowboat. He slipped the boatsman a few shillings, and they set off into the harbor. His destination loomed a few hundred yards offshore, a merchant ship called the HMS Duchess of Gordon. Anchored nearby was a massive British warship, silently defending the Duchess from any unwanted guests. As the boatsman rowed, Matthews glanced nervously at shore. He had permission for this excursion to visit the tightly guarded Duchess. He told the Continental Army it was for a diplomatic matter. But if they discovered the true reason, Matthews might lose his office, and maybe his life. Matthews hated being on the water. He got seasick easily. But lately, he'd been feeling a lot safer in the harbor than on dry land. Even though he was the mayor of a major American city, Matthews was openly loyal to the British king, and after General Washington's army came marching into town in April 1776, he instantly became an outcast. When they arrived at the Duchess of Gordon, Matthews climbed a ladder onto the deck. There he was greeted by William Tryon, the British-appointed governor who represented the king in New York. He welcomed Matthews with open arms and invited him inside. Governor Tryon had docked offshore for months, unable to step foot in New York City because the revolutionary colonists despised him so much. But Tryon was too proud to just go home. Instead, he lingered just outside the bounds of the city in the harbor. From his ship, he held secret meetings and developed a vast network of loyalist informants. Mayor Matthews was one of the many spies that kept him informed of the Continental Army's activities. As Matthews entered Tryon's office, the governor beamed. He unlocked a trunk by his desk and revealed a stash of rifles and muskets. They had been freshly made by a loyalist gunsmith and delivered just a few days before. Guns were a valuable commodity and hard to come by. Matthews had orchestrated the trade. Tryon clapped Matthews on the back and congratulated him on a job well done. Then he handed Matthews a stack of money to pay the gunsmith. But as Matthews flipped through the banknotes, he paused. Tryon had given him nearly twice the amount they'd agreed upon. But Tryon told Matthews it wasn't a mistake. He explained that the extra money was for something else. The guns were a nice start, but if they really wanted to win the war, they needed to get strategic. The problem was General Washington. He had outsmarted the British Army in Boston, despite his poorly trained and undersupplied troops. The man was a serious threat. Something had to be done about him. In a noisy tavern in New York City, gunsmith Gilbert Forbes called out for another drink. He'd already had several to calm his nerves. In his field of work, war was good for business. But as a British loyalist in George Washington's New York, he was working for the enemy. If anyone found out he was making weapons for the crown, he could end up in prison. A crowd of ragtag Continental soldiers were singing drunkenly in the corner. They had been getting louder and more out of control all evening. But Forbes gritted his teeth and tried to ignore them. He looked forward to the day when the British Army would put these insolent farmers back in their place. The door to the tavern swung open, and Forbes looked up. He saw Mayor David Matthews walk in, looking anxiously around like he might have been followed. Matthews stood out in the rough tavern. He was way too clean, too well dressed. Matthews saw Forbes and sat down at his table. His eyes shifted to the drunken soldiers in the corner. Forbes told him not to worry. The men were far too interested in their beer to notice the two of them. Matthews handed Forbes an envelope under the table. It was his payment for the gun sale. The gunsmith counted the bills, but there was more in it than there should have been. He looked up at Matthews, who checked to make sure no one was listening. In hushed tones, Matthews said he knew that Forbes spent a lot of time inside the city's taverns, making friends over pints of beer. He was good at talking to people. Governor William Tryon wanted to use that skill to his advantage. Matthews told Forbes to use the extra money to bribe Continental soldiers who were willing to help the Loyalists. With Forbes' help, they could turn Washington's men into spies, right under his nose. Forbes' eyes lit up. He looked over to the men drinking in the corner. They seemed far more interested in drinking than fighting for a cause. They were not rich men, yet they were emptying their pockets to buy the next round. Forbes glanced down at the bills in his hand. Then he looked at Matthews. He told him he didn't think they would have much trouble finding recruits. A few months later, in mid-May 1776, George Washington's officers were briefing him on New York City's lack of fortifications, but he was struggling to focus. He had a daunting task in front of him. The Continental Army needed to build defenses around the city to protect against British cannon fire, but it seemed impossible to armor the whole city, especially when it was surrounded by water. Plus, Washington's soldiers were easily distracted by alcohol, gambling, and brothels. Suddenly, one of Washington's lifeguards burst into the room. He was out of breath and holding up a letter. Washington grabbed it and ripped it open. But when he read it, his blood started to boil. The letter reported news of a Loyalist plot. The personal valet of a New York congressman had been caught smuggling information to Governor Tryon's ship in the harbor. Washington put the letter down and rubbed his temples. The citizens of New York had been banned from communicating with the exiled governor for the last 3 months, but Tryon had evidently still found a way to get informants to come to him. Washington was tired of being a step behind Tryon. With every plot the Continental Army uncovered, it seemed 2 more sprang up in its place. Washington couldn't take direct action against Tryon since he was protected in the harbor by a British warship, and the Americans didn't yet have a navy. If he wanted to stop the governor's spying, he needed to come up with a plan. Washington took a deep breath and dismissed the officers. It was getting late, and he needed to think. As he walked up to his office, an idea started to form in his mind. By candlelight, Washington wrote a letter to the New York Provincial Congress, the colonists' governing body of the city. He had too much on his plate to chase down all the schemes of Loyalists in New York. He needed a dedicated team of spy catchers to foil the British plans. As Washington wrote his letter, the Loyalist gunsmith, Gilbert Forbes, was becoming very friendly with 2 Continental soldiers at a tavern only a few blocks away. One was an Irishman named Thomas Hickey, the other an American named William Green. As they clinked glasses on their second round of drinks that evening, Green toasted the health of King George. For a moment, Forbes eyed him suspiciously. He wasn't sure if the soldier was testing him. But, trusting his instincts, he raised his glass and responded, "To the King." A smile crept onto Green's face, and Forbes knew he was right. They were on the same side. Forbes had suspected both men represented a growing strain of Loyalist converts among the Continental troops. They were fed up with serving the American cause. They didn't get enough food, their pay was constantly delayed, and they slept in cramped quarters, often with more than 20 soldiers in a single room. But, as Forbes learned, the worst of all these offenses was General Washington himself. He didn't approve of the soldiers drinking, so he had banned the city from selling alcohol to them. If they were caught drunk in public, they would be whipped or imprisoned. The men had joined the army to fight for independence, but if their new country was already taking away their rights, they may as well go back to the British way of doing things. At least the English were teetotalers. Forbes told Hickey and Green that he had a way for them to get back at the Continental Army and get paid. If they helped the British, they'd earn 10 shillings a week. Not only that, but when the British won the war, the men would receive land as a reward for their loyalty. The soldiers' eyes lit up as they listened to Forbes' pitch. Hickey leaned forward eagerly. He was almost 50 years old and had been a soldier his whole life. He whispered to Forbes that he was tired of being told what to do. He liked the thought of settling down in a place of his own to start a family after the war. He could finally be his own man. Forbes pulled a slip of paper from his coat. It was a list of soldiers who had turned their backs on the Continental Army. Hickey and Green eagerly added their names to the list. Then they wrote down their unit's name. Both of them were lifeguards to General George Washington. A month later, Thomas Hickey stood outside General Washington's office. The New York summer heat was sweltering, especially indoors. Hickey wanted nothing more than to get out of there. His mind wandered to the fantasy he'd been obsessing over for weeks, living on his own land and setting his own schedule. The thought of it never failed to bring a smile to his face. But he snapped out of his daydream as he heard Washington's voice through the wall. It wasn't completely clear, but the general seemed to be asking about Governor William Tryon and his involvement in conspiracies. Hickey leaned in closer. Then he heard the voice of John Jay, one of Washington's most trusted advisors. Jay said there were rumors that Tryon was bribing Continental soldiers to turn loyalist right under their noses. Hickey felt his stomach cramp. They might already know he had flipped. As Hickey pressed his ear closer to listen, he heard Washington and his advisors close out the meeting. Hickey backed away from the wall and stood at attention just as the door swung open. He prayed that Washington wouldn't notice the nervous look on his face. Hickey saluted, and Washington told him to be at ease. The general introduced Hickey to his advisors as a trusted member of his lifeguard. Hickey nodded dutifully, trying to remain calm. Then Washington handed him an unsealed envelope and asked him to deliver it to one of his captains. Hickey saluted once again and hurried off, grateful to finally escape. When he got far enough away, Hickey decided to open the envelope and found 2 pages inside. The first was a warning about Loyalist infiltration of the army. The second was a copy of Washington's schedule. Hickey couldn't believe what he was reading. Previously, Hickey had only agreed to spy on the Continental Army and surrender when the British invaded. But these pages presented an entirely new opportunity, one that could secure the British victory before they even arrived. With this, Hickey could inform Governor Tryon exactly where General Washington would be. They could kidnap Washington for the British Army and interrogate him, or even assassinate him if they thought it necessary. Hickey felt the twinge of guilt. He disagreed with many of Washington's policies, but he still respected him as a man. He didn't like to think his actions might get him killed. But Washington couldn't offer what Tryon had. The promise of money, land, and security was too much to turn down. If Washington's head was the price of his independence, Hickey was willing to pay it. He tucked the letter into his coat as he rushed out toward the harbor. He needed to get the information to Governor Tryon. On June 15, 1776, Isaac Ketchum poked at his dismal jailhouse food. His ankles, which were bound in leg irons, were developing sores. He looked up at the fading light coming through the barred window at the top of his cell. His stomach churned. With each passing night he spent here, he felt less hope of ever getting out. Ketchum had been stuck in the prison under City Hall for a month, sharing a cell with a rotating cast of loyalists and petty thieves. He was in for counterfeiting, even though he hadn't actually committed the crime himself. He had fallen in with some bad people and agreed to help transport the fake money they had made. But he got caught. And now, as a widower and father of 6, his children were left to fend for themselves. He had sent several appeal letters to the New York Provincial Congress pleading his innocence, but had gotten no response. The authorities didn't seem to care that he had only agreed to the scheme because he was in a desperate situation. As he stewed in his misery, the cell door opened and shook Ketchum out of his thoughts. He watched the guards throw 2 new prisoners into the cell. Ketchum hurried to the door, asking if there was any word about his case, but the guards told him they had no news. The iron doors closed with an all-too-familiar clang. The 2 prisoners began cursing their new surroundings. Ketchum noticed one had an Irish accent. Ketchum listened as they complained about the Continental Army and praised the king. This would not have been unusual, but then he overheard them say that they were Continental soldiers. Eager to learn more, Ketchum interrupted them. He said he couldn't help but overhear their troubles. He wanted them to know he was on their side. Ketchum asked their names. The Irishman looked him up and down suspiciously, but his American companion seemed eager to make friends. He introduced himself as William Green. His friend was named Thomas Hickey. Ketchum asked how they ended up in prison. Green said they'd been caught carrying counterfeit money. Even though they were trusted guards of George Washington himself, the Continental Army had still arrested them. Ketchum explained he was in for the same crime. He offered his sympathies. He knew what it was like to be in dire straits, and for the Continental Army to turn its back on its own. The men nodded. Then Green smiled and told Ketchum that he didn't need to worry. They'd all be free soon because the war was going to end within a month. Ketchum asked what he meant by that. The 2 soldiers looked at each other. They remained quiet for a moment, but then the Irishman Hickey spoke up. He explained they were carrying out a plot against George Washington, one he would never see coming. Ketchum's pulse quickened. An idea suddenly popped into his head. It would be a long shot, but Ketchum might just have found his way out of jail. Two days later, on June 17, 1776, Isaac Ketchum fidgeted with the chains around his wrists. He was sitting outside the council chamber at City Hall. It was the first time he'd been above ground in over a month. He tried to savor the fresh air as long as he could. He had written to the New York Provincial Congress that he had urgent information about a loyalist plot. His freedom now rested on them believing him. If they didn't, they'd send him right back to rot in the prison. The thought of never seeing his children again made his heart ache. The door to the council chamber swung open. A man in a coat and breeches walked out. He introduced himself as John Jay. He asked Ketchum to come inside. Ketchum shuffled in as quickly as his leg irons would allow. Inside, he saw the rest of the Provincial Congress waiting, 25 men in powdered wigs. Jay asked Ketchum to give his information. Ketchum explained that his 2 cellmates were Continental soldiers who were secretly working with the British. They reported to a man named Forbes, who then communicated with someone on a British ship in the harbor. Ketchum said the soldiers told him all about a British plan to destroy the main bridge out of Manhattan, called the King's Bridge. They were also scheming to arm Loyalist civilians before the arrival of the British fleet. The color drained from John Jay's face as Ketchum spoke. He leaned forward and asked if Ketchum had anything else. Ketchum took a deep breath. If anything was going to earn him his freedom, it was this. He said that the men had told him they were part of Washington's lifeguards unit, but they weren't there to protect him. They were going to abduct him and turn him over to the enemy. Ketchum watched as the congressman broke into worried conversation. All he could do was pray that they'd let him go free for the information he had brought them. Eventually, John Jay turned back to Ketchum. He thanked him for the information. Then he cleared his throat and told Ketchum that he was going to be returned to jail. Ketchum's heart sank. All hope of going home to his children was suddenly lost. But Jay wasn't finished. He said he was sending Ketchum back in jail to be a spy. He needed to find out more from the soldiers in his cell. If his information was good, he would be freed. Ketchum felt a wave of relief. He could be a spy for a few more days if it meant getting out of that jail cell for good. A week later, on June 23, 1776, John Jay watched as the Loyalist gunsmith Gilbert Forbes walked into the chamber at City Hall. His hands and ankles were in chains. Jay felt a strange mix of fear and excitement bubbling in his stomach. Congress had recently chosen him and 2 other men to form the Committee on Conspiracies. Their mission was to report to General Washington on counter-espionage, and they were close to uncovering the secret plot against him. Things had moved quickly since Isaac Ketchum's testimony. The committee knew they needed to go after the Loyalists, bribing Continental soldiers to flip sides. Since Tryon was still untouchable on his ship in the harbor, Jay and the committee settled for the next best thing: arresting New York's Loyalist mayor, David Matthews. Matthews had been doing Tryon's bidding for too long, and Jay had finally had enough. On Washington's orders, they raided Matthews' estate in the middle of the night. Matthews was awoken to the sounds of Continental soldiers tearing his home apart. He was dragged out of his house, bleary-eyed and still in his nightshirt. When Jay interrogated Matthews, the mayor swore he knew nothing about the plot against Washington. He said the most he had done was pass money between Governor Tryon and a gunsmith named Gilbert Forbes. Jay didn't believe Matthews, but he was happy to have a new suspect. He was sure that Forbes was the same gunmaker that Isaac Ketchum's cellmates had been working with. After the raid on Matthews' home, Continental soldiers arrested Forbes at a tavern. When he was brought in, Forbes refused to give up any names. But Jay needed Forbes to talk if they wanted to figure out who else was involved in the plan. So Jay decided it was time for drastic action. At Jay's behest, a minister came to the jail and told the gunsmith that he was going to be executed for treason unless he gave up information. Forbes was horrified. He knew he would be punished for his crimes. He thought he might get jail time. But executed? In the end, fear got the best of him, and he started talking. In the chamber at City Hall, Jay and his fellow committee members took turns interrogating Forbes. Over the course of 2 hours, Forbes revealed the whole plot: the sale of the guns, Mayor Matthews bringing him the money, and his recruitment of the soldiers. Best of all, Forbes turned over his list of names. Almost a dozen were Washington's lifeguards. Even the general's housekeeper was in on the plot. Jay was horrified at how deeply Tryon had infiltrated Washington's inner circle, but now he knew the identity of everyone involved in the scheme. Washington's trusted advisor left his fellow committee members to deal with Forbes. He needed to warn the commander-in-chief. George Washington was in his office, poring over a map of the city, when John Jay burst in. He handed Washington a piece of paper. Washington took it. It was a list of names. He recognized many of them. He knew what this meant. His soldiers, his lifeguards, had betrayed him. Washington slumped down at his desk. His army was coming apart at the seams, right when they needed to band together. He sat motionless, trying to decide what to do next. Finally, Washington spoke. He thanked Jay for a job well done. The Committee on Conspiracies had uncovered the plot before the British could act on it. They had almost certainly saved his life. Still, he didn't want anyone to know what the committee had found. If they were to go after every person involved in the scheme, it would expose far too many cracks. The morale of the Continental Army might be ruined beyond repair. The British Army was arriving in only a few days. He couldn't risk it. Jay seemed frustrated by the general's response, but nodded respectfully. He reminded Washington that someone needed to be punished for betraying the revolution. They couldn't just let the criminals go. They needed to send a message to other potential traitors. Washington knew Jay was right. He asked who they had the most evidence against. Jay said their best case was against Thomas Hickey. Washington hung his head sadly. Hickey had been one of his closest bodyguards. He had spent countless hours with him and liked the man. His betrayal hurt deeply. But Washington knew he didn't have a choice. He gave Jay the order. Thomas Hickey had to die. On June 28, 1776, Thomas Hickey marched slowly to the gallows. It took all of his strength to hold up his head. The last few days had felt like a bad dream. Even when he was dragged in front of a court-martial and asked to defend himself, Hickey didn't believe he was actually going to be hanged. But now, the noose was dangling right in front of him. Hickey climbed the stairs up to the gallows. By now, his heart was in his throat. He looked over at the crowd assembling to watch him hang. Tens of thousands of people. He spotted George Washington sitting atop a gray horse at the front of the crowd. The general stared at him, stone-faced. Hickey remembered the warmth and trust he was used to seeing on the general's face. Washington's other lifeguards surrounded him. Hickey knew more than a few of them had turned against Washington too, but here they were, standing at attention, as if they'd never even considered betraying him. He looked at each of them, but most avoided his gaze. Hickey knew he was being made an example of, and that William Greene and the other lifeguards were being spared. He wondered if he'd been chosen as the scapegoat because he was Irish-born, or if he was just unlucky. As he awaited his fate, an officer read out Hickey's offenses. Hickey nearly winced when he heard the officer say the word treason. Tears welled up in his eyes. For a moment, he pictured the life Gilbert Forbes had promised him. Money, land, freedom. Hickey had wanted it all so badly. But in the end, was it all worth dying for? Thomas Hickey was hanged the same day Thomas Jefferson presented the Declaration of Independence to the Continental Congress. If the Loyalist plot to abduct or assassinate Washington had succeeded, the American army likely would have collapsed. George Washington would never have become the beloved father of a country. He'd be just another failed revolutionary. The efforts of the Committee on Conspiracies saved his life and gave the American Revolution a fighting chance at success. 2 weeks after Hickey's execution, Washington gathered his troops in a field north of the city and read the Declaration of Independence aloud. He made clear that the Continental Army was not just fighting for political power. They were there to form a new nation, free of British rule. Discovering the British plot encouraged Washington to embrace spycraft even more as the war went on. The Committee on Conspiracies, led by John Jay, continued to sniff out British spies for the rest of the war. By 1778, Washington had created an entire spy network, known as the Culper Ring, to gather information about British activity. They used coded messages and invisible ink to smuggle intelligence. These are methods still used today. In many ways, the plot to assassinate George Washington resulted in the birth of American espionage.